I am going to leave the floor to another colleague from the T Factor team, Marco Tognetti. Marco is the CEO of LAMA, which is an innovation agency based in Firenze, Florencia, that is at the core center of the coordination of the project. So Marco, please go ahead.
Thanks, Karim, and thanks everybody. Sorry for the little delay in the timing, but I'm sure now we will enjoy this session. I'm very proud to moderate this session today, and I'm really happy to see how many people are connected. Maybe this is the good face of the moon in these coronavirus times. So whilst we can meet in person, we can easily gather online. So thanks again for being here. I'll jump immediately into the topic. The title of this session is meanwhile participatory meanwhile uses, if there are costs or an opportunity in urban regeneration. And I think we all agree that meanwhile uses are important, and at least on three levels. We know that they can impact on the marketing activities of an area. We know also that they can contribute to manage the conflict and to build consensus with the citizens, and we also know that they can also build the pilot of final uses. So they are the spark of the uses of the regeneration intervention. But this implies that we have to invest in meanwhile uses, and we can invest on different degrees according to the type of meanwhile use we want to realize. Phrasing in other terms the title of our session, the great question is that is if meanwhile uses are like the cherry on top of the cake. So if there is, yeah, great, we're happy. But if not, you at least have the cake, so there's no problem. Or if meanwhile uses are a fundamental ingredient of our cake. So if we don't have, it really changed the taste of the final product, so the cake. For trying to answer to this question, I'll be helped by Filippo Addarii, who is CEO of Plus Value, and Plus Value is also a key partner in T Factor. Filippo will spark the conversation with our distinguished panelists that I will introduce now, helping with some provocations to stimulate their reactions and listen to their suggestions and ideas about the topic. Our speakers are Giovanni Manfredi. Then we have Jonas Bystrom, he's a lead engineer at the European Investment Bank, and Laura Pellegrinelli, she's placemaking development manager at Lendlease. So I think we can leave the floor to Filippo with his provocations and trying to have this conversation. The format is the three speakers will have 10 minutes to react, and then I'll leave to some Q&A time with all the participants in this meeting. So thanks, Filippo. I'll leave the floor to you, and we'll hear with pleasure your provocations.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I've been tasked to provoke our speakers, and so I prepared my script. But after listening to all these morning interventions, clearly I realized that my provocation is definitely necessary. Very interesting ideas and examples, but I believe my job is to play the devil advocate. I mean, we have been working with Plus Value, with investors and urban regeneration, big players for the last 5 years. I describe my job as swimming with the sharks learning how their feeding habits not to be turned into their next meal. What does it mean? It means that when we work with very serious, big regeneration projects, we work with hungry, driven players, animals. And watch out. I mean, there is no difference between the public and the private, by the way. They just have different feeding habits. The ones of the private, it's more on the profit. The one of the public is on the political consensus. But this is a reality check that we need to have in mind, and we are not going to change their acquisitive instincts. Moreover, we have two more problems. On one side, we have COVID, which is taking a massive hit, as it was mentioned by previous speakers, on the value generation and sustainability of those projects. I mean, construction sites are stuck. There is an increase of costs, plus people cannot use them. So that is a massive problem, I believe, for meanwhile processes. But also there was one point raised by several speakers, the value of meanwhile projects to build trust, ownership, let's say also to manage the risk of having the community to backfire. Now, how do we match this with the rise of populism and constant and systematic distrust by the public towards big projects led by the public or the private investors? This is serious stuff. Now, in our experience, we learned over these years that there isn't a magic formula, there is no model, there is no map to follow, but a very simple principle has to be, is a guiding star for our work, that you need to align public and private interests. Investors understand and have interest, and they are very happy to generate public value when this is aligned with their own plans and interest. And this is possible, as for instance, the good example of the one in the Amsterdam showed, and there are many others. Now, to do this, we need to understand the value of these meanwhile projects in a very realistic and concrete way. So for a moment, idealists, shut down and let's have an hard conversation. So my questions for our speakers, who actually represent a wide array of public and private investors, is about the value of meanwhile interests. How do you value, how do you value those meanwhile projects? And how do you measure it? And measuring means not writing a nice glossy report for the public. It's also about reporting to your shareholders who want to understand why you are spending time and resources on those projects. Moreover, when we talk about value, it seems that those meanwhile projects, except for some visionary, enlightened or crazy investors, they tend to fall on the shoulders of, or it would be more correct to say in the budget of the public authorities, especially local authorities, or in the budget of philanthropic institutions. And if you're lucky, on the CSR program of corporation. Is this realistic and sustainable? Especially when we talk about long-term large projects. I think this is probably enough. If you will be able also to make references to the two issues. One is COVID, but the other one, and we must recognize it's transformative within the European context, is the European Green Deal. And so the green agenda, or the transition towards the green agenda, which is going to influence, although it's in infancy, and might play a very important role in giving value to those meanwhile projects. I stop here, and although I keep the role to, prop you if you don't answer as you should. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Filippo. Thank you very much. So, Giovanni, the floor is yours. 10 minutes to react.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm the shark. So when I like Filippo's introduction because it's refreshing and it goes straight to the point, which is something that I deal with every day in my role. I follow a large development in Florence that Marco is familiar with, and I think. What Filippo mentioned goes right to the heart of some issues that I face, because we're investing a lot of money in meanwhile uses, and I have to justify that to a number of people, right? Mostly to my investors. Why do I need to spend those millions of euros? Because that's the order of magnitude. It's not 100,000 euros, it's millions. And on the other hand, to the neighborhood, the stakeholders, right? So very, very refreshing. I will try and go, straight to the point. How do you measure the value of meanwhile uses? I think meanwhile uses have 3 different kinds of values that must be measured differently. The first one is a financial value. What my investors, pension funds, are chiefly concerned with. They invest their money here because they need to pay their pensions. So financial is the one that I feel I should speak more about because it may be what I'm able to offer the more detailed perspective. The second type of value is, once you accept that we have to generate a profit in order to do our urban regeneration project, you can argue, however, about the quality of that project, that profit. That profit may be more sustainable or less sustainable. And I think if we as investors, we are able to accept a lower profit if it is a better quality profit. So that's the second value, I think. The second type of value is a sustainability value. The third value that I see is a social value. What Filippo mentioned in his intervention. So what we do on temporary activities may create or destroy a lot of value for other people, for society as a whole. Externalities, right? So these are the 3 types of values that I see. And like Filippo, I think there's a bigger discussion here, about how capitalism prices externalities, right? That we don't want to go into right now. I don't think it's the purpose of this discussion, because we could go on for hours about, how things are priced in a capitalistic society, and is it the correct way to organize a society? That is a discussion we're not going to go into. So we take for granted that society is capitalist, that I need to take my profit. That profit should be as sustainable as I can make it. But at the moment, I don't benefit from positive externalities in the same way as I'm not penalized by negative externalities, other than from an ethical point of view, right? And hopefully what I'm saying makes sense. It's a bit theoretical. I wanted to go in the financial value. So the first one of my 3, and explain how I see, the financial value of meanwhile uses. I think, and many of you will have heard this before, but I'm a real estate investor. We invest in real estate. The old saying goes, real estate has 3 value drivers: location, location, and location, right? They say that is all. Everything else you can change, your location you cannot. Well, to me, that is really where meanwhile uses have a value. They are one of the few levers that we have as real estate investors to change location. I think the other two are infrastructure and anchors, right? I think with meanwhile uses, if they're done well in the way in which Marco has described, so they communicate, but they engage, and they are a prototype. They can really change where we are, right? Where we invest. That is how you measure the value of meanwhile uses purely in a financial point of view. So if you take the sharks, even the most terrible sharks will invest in meanwhile uses if that means that your location becomes more rich, more vibrant, more diverse, more interesting, right? So I think one of the questions for that Filippo posed was, who pays for it, right? If you are an ugly, evil shark, the answer to that question must be your customers, right? You run a business, forgetting about everything else. You need your customers to pay for that extra cost that you are doing. So that's the kind of the ugly truth, I think, as Filippo described it. So we need to sell for a slightly higher margin in order to justify it purely from a private capitalistic point of view. The good news is that investors are changing their perspective. So luckily, many of our investors, they're no longer the ugly, rationalistic, pure profit sharks. They do value the quality of the profit that they will generate, or the return that they will generate. Therefore, luckily, they're happy to pay some of their value because they see that they're happy to accept a lower financial return because we're doing something good. No, that is the third. That is the second, and it's also a big financing source because if you can finance yourself at a cheaper rate, then you can invest money. Social is difficult. Is the real bit that is difficult to finance for a private investor like us. But this is where there could be a positive collaboration, as Filippo says, with the public, as long as the interests are aligned. So that's a little bit how I'd like to answer. I want to say one more thing, maybe two actually. One is that Filippo mentioned the distrust of the public versus a large project, and I can see that. I have it myself when I look at large projects that I'm not involved in. I think in Florence, and maybe here Marco as a Florentine can comment, Manifattura Tabacchi is quite well received. We have surprisingly, a very good relationship with most stakeholders, the administration, the neighbors, etc. I think one of the reasons is that we have done the reasoning that Filippo has said very early on. So I think we're clear between us as to what our roles are. What is the role of the administration? What is the role of the private investor? And what is the role of the neighbors? And we have a dialogue without without hypocrisy. No, I mean, if you pretend that you do an intervention, if you're a private person, a private organization, and you pretend that you do an intervention purely for social purposes, you're lying. And I think people feel that. So I think having an open conversation about the topics that Filippo has mentioned is really at the basis of this thing in project, but there's a private component. So I think people know that we have to do a project. They accept it as a profit. They accept it as a constraint. And that is the basis on which we can try to do as good quality a profit as we can, but also we can engage to try and generate the maximum amount of positive externalities that we can, as opposed to negative externalities. So yeah, I think this is quite hard as an answer, I think, Filippo, but I hope you were looking for that and not me shying away from my responsibility. I have a heart as well as a person, so I could tell, much more interesting stuff. I had prepared actually a much softer, richer speech, but I think it's more interesting if I do the hard part and give you the ability to retort. Hopefully, I haven't exceeded my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I'm really happy to know that even sharks have a heart. No, yeah, we know that. And no, but really the good news that sustainable profit and good profit is something that can be considered as an ethical improvement about how the investors look at investments. This is really an interesting thing on the side of intangible suggestions, while I think the other side, the leverage that meanwhile users can play in terms of going beyond the starting features of allocation. So allowing investors to measure the value they can create. This is also very definitely a very important point that can also help matching the intangible part with a very concrete part that Filippo was provoking and asking to react. As we are talking about investments, I think the opinion, the perspective of Jonas Bystrom from the European Investment Bank maybe now be really interesting to hear. So I'll leave the floor to Jonas. Please, if you are here, I'll leave to you 10 minutes to react to Filippo's provocation.
Hello, first of all, a check, can you hear me?
Yeah, definitely.
For some reason, the video does not really seem to be mobile. I don't know if that is a problem on my side. Can you see a moving, an active video?
I can't see your video, no, but I can hear you very well.
Turn it off and turn it on. I have it activated, but it seemed to not be working. So you will. Ah, no.
There you are. Yeah.
Here I am, but not really very mobile. I don't know why it's freezing. Anyway, I will do what I can without the video, and you will do with what I say rather than with how I gesticulate. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this interesting session and to have an insight into this very interesting project, the T4 project, and also having got a good reason to dive in a bit further than I've done before into the topic of mean value uses. I think that since the EIB is a bit different kind of financial institution than what Giovanni presented before, a bit less shark-like, we can put it, it may be a good idea for me to just introduce the EIB, the European Investment Bank. I'm connecting from the headquarters in Luxembourg, and we are one of the EU institutions, the EU bank, the EU's long-term lending arm. And we are also a bank that focuses quite a lot on climate, on environmental sustainability. We are committed to dedicate 50% of our financing to these two objectives by 2025, and we are aiming to be fully Paris aligned by the end of this year. So climate environmental sustainability is very high on our agenda. And as the EU bank, we are a policy-driven bank. So we are aligning what we do to policy made in Brussels, and we have 4 public policy goals that direct and indicate what we should finance. And that is environmental protection, it's infrastructure, it's innovation, and it's SMEs. So these are public policy goals that are in a way quite relevant to urban development, urban regeneration, and to some extent also to meanwhile use, even though we have less direct experience of that, if any direct, and I come to that a bit later. In 2019, we provided 64 billion of financing to 854 projects, where 90% was in the EU, the rest outside the EU, and around a third of that was in urban areas. So we are doing a lot in supporting EU cities and also a few cities outside the EU. And while I am not able to point at direct investments in meanwhile use, I will relate a bit to what we do and why it is relevant and interesting to us nevertheless. But I mean, as a person, I've seen the need and the rationale. The city in Sweden, Eskilstuna, where I come from, every time I go back, I see more and more high street center retail spaces being empty, not really being used for what they should. And there is a need to think meanwhile use in that city. And in Luxembourg City, one of the richest, I think, cities in the EU, Luxembourg has the highest GDP per capita, there are also non-used retail space. And here the city has invested in a scheme to transform some of these into pop-up shops. So they enable startups, new entrepreneurs to rent very well located shops for a 6-month period to ensure that there is a bit more liveliness in the city and also more diversity shop-wise. But as a large institution, mainly working with large investments and where we have kind of procedures set up for those kind of investments, we are not really able to support the really small scale investments. And meanwhile use may also in some cases, as we've heard and as we see, not necessarily involve really large capital expenditures. It could be renovating, refurnishing, and letting space for intermediate meanwhile use. So from that reason, it's not so that we have a long list, or I can point at very concrete examples of how we have supported this. But nevertheless, I mean, in this urban sector, we support projects that make life in urban areas more sustainable. And often it is integrated urban development, urban regeneration, and renewal of different kinds. And in that context, there are also often mixed use schemes that may involve property developers, public sector developers, investors, and foster the kind of partnerships that the meanwhile use is building on and that enable exploring this. And from that point of view, it is relevant for us to consider and to look into this. And we do it for a number of reasons, which I think I will try to summarize. First of all, the meanwhile use can have an important urban development and regeneration impact. And as a public bank, we are not just interested in getting our money back with some interest, but also to have an impact, an additionality, to have value added, maybe beyond what a commercial bank can and should do, because we are, as I said, the public bank, we are working in the interest of the public good, and we try to promote the EU policies. And like we heard from the previous speaker, location is, of course, an important aspect in urban development regeneration. And then, redeveloping, enabling, and meanwhile use could be ways of promoting the densifying mixed-use development that is adding sustainability, adding ambience, and long-term livability in cities. And from that point of view, it is relevant and it is important. It also, like we've heard, and I think seen in many of the examples and previous presentations, have important economic development impact in the ability to enable, to facilitate allow testing of new types of products, activities, maybe new business models, maybe new approaches to many of the things that we are doing and maybe are not doing in a very sustainable manner. So there are approaches, opportunities to really use these mean values and the opportunities presented by really boost the economic opportunities, mobilizing maybe parts of the society that are not really businessmen and women, are not really used to taking the first steps into entrepreneurship. But like have been in the case in Luxembourg here with the pop-up shops, they have really enabled young, bright ideas to be tried out on a smaller scale. And as such, these mean values also have a social development impact, which is also relevant for a public bank like the EIB, not least by, as I referred to before, mobilizing a larger share of the population to engage in economic activities, in social activities, maybe with some economic aspects, and thereby also to widen the economic base of the city, to create new jobs, and to build local social resilience to whatever future may bring. COVID-19 is one example of very unforeseen events that have had a very, very large impact on society. And COVID-19 and mean values, like someone said, it is reducing the use of whatever the meanwhile use entrepreneurs, renters are offering. But on the other hand, it's also creating new opportunities for mean values. We see in many cities that the impact on the small scale companies and retailers is quite impactful, and there is more and more opportunities and more need to think mean values in the further development and in the recovery after an pandemic like the COVID-19. And finally, there are also, I think, in these various aspects of economic social development, also the opportunity for municipalities, for cities, for entrepreneurs, and for others to really promote sustainable and green developments. There are really good examples of how cities have invested in renovating old cultural heritage, for example. They have turned it into innovation labs, like we heard in some examples. They have turned it into circular testing labs and into other testing environments, or into office hotels or entrepreneurs hotels that, with the right kind of approach and support from those who operate them, could really entice and promote the impact of the selection of and the approach towards the more sustainable green approaches to use these meanwhile spaces. So from circular point of view, sharing, leasing, repair shops, second-hand sale are, I think, very interesting opportunities to consider and maybe to prioritize when approaching the opportunities to take such spaces into constructive and also beneficial use for the city and for the urban environment. Also, if like examples have been made, thinking a bit long term, it's also then necessary to think of the opportunity to design new buildings, new developments, to allow and enable modular and flexible use, to ensure that buildings are having this modularity and the flexibility in the design briefs, so that whatever happens in the future, whatever changes there are in economic fabric, social fabrics, there are opportunities to remodulate, to realign to the need to maybe interim flexible uses, and then also to design not for demolition, but disassembly in the end. Measurement-wise, a bank like EIB, of course, with public money, has a lot of scrutiny on what we do. And we measure, like you mentioned before, also the returns on the projects, financial returns, economic returns, looking a bit beyond just the financials. But being a climate, environmental, sustainability-driven bank, we also have very clear focus on what in the projects and the components we do in projects are really contributing to these two targets. We also try to measure jobs created. We are looking at other impact, etc. So we try really to measure not just profit returns, but also other more social, more environmental, more climate and impacts, where we can really see that we are adding value beyond maybe what a commercial bank can do. There was also a question and reference to who will and who should pay for this. And I am not sure I can give a clear and concrete answer to that, other than saying that maybe a good base to build a conclusion on that question is to look at who is actually benefiting from this mean values. And in some cases, like we've heard, the developers could have a good benefit by marketing the future use of a development, by enabling testing of new approaches to using maybe mixed use developments, etc., etc. But there are also these more public, social, economic, environmental benefits of using meanwhile use spaces that may build the case for that municipalities could have a good reason and maybe a good interest to subsidize and to ensure that whatever is not possible for the developers to shoulder in the form of costs of renovating or setting in order could be covered through municipal subsidies, etc. I think time-wise, I probably passed my 10 minutes, and I'm happy to try to complement later on, but I think I rest the case for now anyway, to leave the floor for the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I underline just 3 things. First, it's really interesting, the mixed use scheme you were talking about. So the idea that an institution like the EIB might see with favor to support PPPs, so partnerships between public and private entities, as this leads to the second point that you evaluate with favor the additionalities that meanwhile uses can create. So all these elements, additional elements like the impact on social, environment and employability, etc. So it would be interesting to widen this conversation also with other investors like you are and with other banks to understand if these additionalities can be seen as constraints to loans or as addition things to decide if to loan money to who entail these additionalities in its investment, or even if this might be seen as a reduction of risk. So the interest rate might be lower exactly because there are these additionalities. So this is very, very interesting. Maybe we will discuss it later on more in detail. And the last thing is you described meanwhile uses as a learning opportunity. So you mentioned the modularity and the business models that can be hosted into and during the time of these meanwhile uses, that they can represent a way to reshape not only the temporary uses, but also reshape how SMEs can regenerate their model to be more flexible and to accept this modularity that's especially in COVID time is so important. So thank you very much for your reflections and ideas. And now I'll leave the floor to Laura. So we go back to a developer from Lendlease, and happy to hear your point of view.
Thank you, Marco and Filippo, for inviting me here. I think this is a very interesting question. So I could say that from a developer perspective, there is more than one value on bringing meanwhile use on site. One is the social inclusion. This means that the meanwhile use installation is an opportunity to connect and to include the local community. It helps from a developer perspective to scale up the project giving also the opportunity to know each other, then for the developer to better understand the potential of that area, knowing associations and people to be involved, and for the community to get close to the project and to start feeling and growing the sense of belonging, which is a very interesting trait of our regeneration projects. Another value is, let's say, to start bringing people, to increase the footfall, in a way to anticipate to the public an area which will be their area. And it means for a developer to start building the place experience of the entire project and to build what we call a destination. And this point, I think it's very linked to what Giovanni said before, to the quality of the place. So if you increase the quality of the place, then you have other tenants, other people who wants to live, to work there. So meanwhile, really helps to build that destination. And another value is also to support the local business, giving them these temporary and open spaces. Often these spaces are in a small format, so they can, in a way, try new ideas. They try a new business, and like let's make an example. If there is a food and beverage offer on one side of, let's say, a street, having a meanwhile use temporary on the opposite side with just chairs and tables and open spaces, that means that you support them, you support the food and beverage business, just with the creation of these spaces. And finally, we have, as Giovanni anticipated before, the financial value, which we need to ensure that, in a way, the business model works. If we raise capital, then we need to demonstrate to the investors that there is a generated value, and we need to ensure that the investment works. It is, in a way, let's say, a puzzle, a balance between social inclusion, economical investment, and the community. And finally, I think measurability is key. So as a developer, it is important to set up from the really beginning KPIs and to be able to measure them monthly, sometimes weekly. And this allows to better understand the benefits and what we could do differently and what works. And in addition, it helps to demonstrate to our investor that this product in specific is successful. Going to the question about costs, who needs to pay for this? It's a difficult question. It's really difficult to answer to this question, because I think there are different players on this game, and the cost should be, in a way, a contribution from all these actors. So the private has the role to reshape an area and to invest a major capital for the realization of a project, and to set up a project in phases and to give space for meanwhile use activations demonstrate an important contribution for the community. And the community, in a way, could benefit from this meanwhile use area, testing new ideas on a small format and having the opportunity to try. And the public contributes to the community as part, let's say, of its DNA. So, and in addition, the public contribution is important to tailor that project in that specific environment. So the key is the synergy between all these actors, because each of them must contribute to the meanwhile use activation. But in this way, the final result will benefit all of them. So
Great,
if you have
thank you very much. And I think, as you are placemaking, it is nice also to see in your job title this word. So you really work to create a place.
Yeah, correct.
And that is exactly what you were saying, talking about building a destination and also promoting synergies between all the different actors. I'd like to hear from Filippo if he is satisfied by the feedbacks we just received from our speakers, and if he wants to add something, some reflections or feedbacks again.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Yes, I really appreciate the honesty and, you know, straightforward speaking about those that are real issues that don't have evident and easy solution. One point that Giovanni touched is, in my view, critical, and it was then rephrased in a very different way by Laura and Jonas, is what he called the pricing of positive externalities that Jonas addressed as additionality. And for Laura, clearly it was the investment of the private investors in those activities that benefit the community, not just the investor. Now, this is a tricky issue, and I'd like to hear more from all of you, because it's what I call private capital for public good, or private action for public good. And this is nice when it's, everybody likes it when it's philanthropy, because you get the reputation, the personal satisfaction. Fine, but this is not enough, because philanthropy is, it's very little compared to what are the financial markets and monetary exchanges. So the challenge that we face in order for the private agents, and I think that includes the individuals as well as the investors, is how, as a society, and so then as institutions, public institutions market, we put a value on that private contribution to public good, because that is the basis to build a public-private welfare strategy towards an inclusive and green transition. And at the moment, I haven't seen anything which is really strategic and mandatory in a certain way. I haven't seen it from the EIB, which has started talking about this from the Juncker plan, but has never put a figure next to that societal impact. So the principle is there, but the investor does not know how to price it. And that has a trickle effects on states, on public authorities, but also financial markets. And financial markets are moving a lot on this. It's interesting that, for instance, Lendlease, but because I know them, put financial equivalent targets for their social value creation, and as well as we have seen in the climate change agenda, where we have very clear, on the other hand, targets. So I'd like all the speakers to come back on this issue about pricing in a way that is not just a personal exercise, but it becomes, we move towards a market and institutional standard. Thank you. Sorry, I took a bit too long, but.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll suggest to invert the line. So let's start with Laura this time.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So, let's say it's a really difficult question. I think it's in a way, maybe perhaps setting, let's say, a model that we can use. And also another point is that meanwhile use activation are becoming more popular and more popular. So I think the data that we can collect from these projects will support us to build, let's say, a benchmarking we can refer to. And it would be very interesting in a way to build a, let's say, model that we can refer to during the development of this project. Because in a way, when you need to make this decision, you need to evaluate different values, different pro and cons. It's really, it depends on the project, it depends on the context where the project is located. So building, let's say, an algorithm or something that we can understand how all these elements will impact in that specific project, it could be helpful, but I think it's a long way. It's a very important question, and as Filippo said, we are not yet there. So yeah, it's understanding together with also the private and the banks how we can build this new approach.
Okay, great. Thanks. Jonas?
Hello. Yeah, I think it's quite a relevant and quite an interesting question. And I think from EIB point of view, we are maybe more kind of used to discussing how to price the negative externalities. It's something that is relevant in our selection of projects, in our cost-benefit analysis. For example,
sì, tu, guarda, io riesco. Cioè, no, io lo abbasso tutto, guarda.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. It was Massimo Bianchini. He has the microphone.
So externalities, for example, carbon is something that is being discussed, is to some extent being used, and that is, I think, what we are more used to when it really comes to pricing externalities. When it comes to maybe more prioritizing rather than pricing the kind of projects with positive externalities, with the kind of additionality, with the positive impact, we have a framework where we really need to argue that the products we do are additional, that they have this value added, and that we are addressing a market failure. And that is ensuring that we are not supporting the kind of standard products that any bank could do, but we are really supporting the kind of products where we as a public bank can add value, can be additional. And we are also, in particular on the loan officer side, I'm working on the project side, dealing more with due diligence and appraisal, but the loan officer, the large group in the EIB who look at the opportunities that clients, countries have when they go to projects, they are very aware of the targets we have now set, this 50% climate action and environmental sustainability target. And of course, that influence their focus with regard to looking for the right kind of clients, looking for the right kind of projects. We also have various policies for sectors like energy. We have a new energy lending policy that has taken a conscious decision out of fossil project support towards supporting more renewable energy and energy efficiency. So selection of projects in light of this target that we have to meet by 2025 is another, if not pricing, at least prioritizing the projects with these positive externalities that we would like to have. We have then, in addition, an option for projects with real good impact to go beyond the 50% limit that EIB usually has to finance a project. We always need to co-finance with someone else, and the limit is usually 50%, but we can, in certain cases, go up to 75%. And that's a way of, in a way, pricing the positive impact of certain types of projects in certain contexts. There is also an opportunity for the loan officers and together with the credit risk officers to modulate the interest rate a bit. And that could be also used as a means of pricing or prioritizing the right kind of projects. But that said, the EIB is building the business model on that we are a AAA rated institution. We are able to raise capital at very advantageous terms, and we pass those advantages on to our clients with a small margin that cover our costs as a kind of non-profit institution. So we are, from the beginning, offering quite good terms, also long-term tenure, and so in general, good things are looking good from the beginning, but we can have this opportunity to modulate if and where needed. But in addition to what we can do as a bank, I think what all of us can maybe look at and promote is to look at public procurement. I mean, in the EU, I think 14, 15, 16% of the EU GDP is publicly procured. And the public there has a really good opportunity to buy in their tender documents, introducing green, circular, maybe also some kind of social criteria, really promote the developers, the companies that are thinking a bit ahead, outside the box, and maybe, if that is the goal, promote this modularity, flexibility, open for the use of existing facilities, building, renovating instead of tearing down and rebuilding, etc. So I think public procurement could be a very interesting kind of means for promoting this valuing of positive externalities of certain kind of products. Thank you.
Thank you. Giovanni.
Yes, I mean, it is a difficult question, no? How you price the social externalities. I mean, I think fundamentally, I believe the answer is a policy thing, right? It cannot be the developer that resolves the issue. Let me start from something very positive. I guess the positive thing is that if you can get the private sector involved and investing in this, in the meanwhile uses, and more broadly, I guess, urban regeneration, you can unlock a huge amount of resource compared to trying to solve the problem without the private sectors. That's the positive thing, no? In terms of how you actually physically do it, right now I see two things that would help us. And remember, it was said at the beginning, we're in a very, very difficult environment now, no? So, you know, we are in a position where it's tough, no? The two things that I see are finance. So Jonas has just spoken, so maybe I will link into that. As a developer, now I'm going to, you know, we're speaking with banks. And, you know, we will need their support as well. We will see how they react to this period of difficulty that is coming. I wouldn't be surprised if some banks turned around to us and said, too much risk, right? So if I knew that, and I don't know exactly how it works with the European Investment Bank as an example, but there are other institutions that are kind of started to think in that way. You know, if a bank came to me and said, if you're going to meet these criteria, we maybe can offer a slightly lower rate, or at least we're going to be there when you need us. That would be a big shift in my way of thinking, because currently the cost that I get for borrowing is the same if I refurbish an office building in the middle of Milan where there's no social value whatsoever. I'm just kind of, you know, extracting value from a piece of real estate, compared to what we're doing in Florence, which I think generates huge positive externalities. And the fact that my financing costs the same, I think is wrong, right? I think it's wrong on the equity side as well. And there, I must say, CDP, which is, we're in a joint venture partnership with CDP, which is the Italian government, is doing a good job. So it seems, because they see that the development creates a huge amount of positive externality, growth, you know, well-being generally in the city, they have decided to remain involved while their plan was to get out, right? So having the government involved on the equity side will help a lot, because it will lower our I guess, our equity returns, right? They're lower because the market is difficult, but that gives us support. So in my mind, institutions were able to very explicitly state, if you meet these social criteria, social, environmental, governance, whatever it is, we will support you. For a private investor, is a very clear way of measuring, right? Because you say, okay, yeah, I can meet that. I can get a better support from a financial point of view. So that's the one very pragmatic way, and I'd be interested to have Jonas' perspective, because maybe he does it already. The second thing is a close collaboration with the local authorities. So something which is fundamental here in Florence, at least, is that we have a good relationship with the local authorities. We, each of us, understand their role. Again, to your original point, don't be hype. You don't need any hypocrisies in this, right? You need to understand what the reciprocal objectives are, and to find those places where you can really work together with them, right? If you can create a relationship of, obviously it's a tough discussion with them sometimes, but if it's done in a fair way, in a transparent way, and you trust each other not to trick each other into stupid things, then I think there's a huge amount of value to generate there, because you as a developer don't have to exploit it. They as an administration have to be